I'm Whitney. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the Pride Center supervisor, and I'm going to be like the moderator interviewer of this situation. For anybody that joins in, there's a chat option, so you can feel free to put questions there, or you can also feel free to use the Q&A option and submit questions there, and we'll do questions at the end. So to get started, I'm going to go ahead and let Reza introduce himself.
Oops. Hi, I'm Reza. My pronouns are they, them. I guess I'm currently a settler on occupied Tataviam land, which is the Valley. I'm a Latinx, I'm queer, non-binary. I've been a sex worker for about 5 years, and I'm a CSUN alum. A lot of the previous activist work I've done has been centered around a lot of migration issues, but I've kind of just been involved in a lot of different things. I grew up in a mixed status family, so my dad is like an anarchist and like a leftist and just super left. My mom is like semi-liberal, so it was really interesting having different sides of the political spectrum. But unfortunately, they were both more conservative on the more conservative side when it comes to gender, sex, and sexuality. I first delved into the world of sex work after myself and a few other folks from CSUN and the activist community in LA had got incarcerated after a Black Lives Matter protest. Basically, we were chanting and screaming in the middle of an intersection at like 3 in the morning, and the cops ended up like kettling us, which is when they surround you and just then make arrests. One person, and I was a stripper at Sam's Hofbrau. And after about 8 months of contemplating and being annoying and asking a bunch of questions, I finally just one day bought a pair of pleasers, put on some lingerie and auditioned, and I ended up getting in. After that, I ended up exploring full service sex work, doming, more fetish stuff, and now because of COVID, I've started to try to transition into more camming and online work, although it is really difficult to be consistent and keep up with it, and it's definitely a big learning curve. So still learning, but it's okay. Always room for growth. But that's a little bit about myself.
That's one heck of an intro. Like I have so many questions already, but so I guess the next question would that we have is what does the body as a site of power mean to you, and how does it relate to the work that you do?
I would say that on a very literal level, our bodies themselves are just so incredible. It took us 5.5 million years of evolution to get us to where we are right now. And as humans, we have all this genetic memory, all of our traumas and triumphs and skills that our ancestors have learned, and that's like literally embedded in us as people in our living, moving bodies. And I think it's so incredible. And I think in a more political sense, as queer folks and as people of color, and just as bodies that don't fit the dominant, thin, cis, heteronormative narratives and norms, I think our existence is a form of resistance. And I think that these same dominant social structures dictate what we're allowed to do with our bodies, whether it's like anti-sodomy laws, abortion bans, anti-prostitution laws, and for us to kind of push back and say, regardless of that, I'm still gonna do what I do, I think that's definitely a source of power, and a source of challenging the status quo. Also, like a lot of gendered labor has been historically undervalued, and it just not has been labeled as real work, but labor is labor at the end of the day. And I think so sex workers tend to use their body in a more intimate way as a means of surviving capitalism. And oftentimes this provides them with a sense of agency. And while sex work is steeped in the same privileges as like that were aforementioned of like white, thin, heterosexual sex workers tend to carry a lot more privilege and can either charge more or have access to more clients, like etc. There's still a market for bodies of all types, and there's a flexibility that accommodates people who are parents, people who are disabled, people who are undocumented, or other folks who can't work like a set schedule or who can't work within these set norms. I also want to say, like, I don't really like talking about customers like too much, but I do think that oftentimes we can provide like safe spaces for them to explore themselves and their needs for touch and intimacy, which is something that's so taboo in our society. We're told that we have to sex and intimacy and touching is only allowed in like one specific place, one specific sense, which is not fair. And it leaves so much to be desired. And I don't know, I think directly challenging that is a source of power within itself. So yeah, hope that answers everything.
For sure. I think you actually a little bit touched on this in terms of like desirability, but so like as a queer person of color and sex worker, how does desirability impact the way that you view yourself, your work, the relationships that you have, in terms of like again, like your body, the work that you do inside and outside of work, and do you feel like there were certain things that you had to unlearn and re-educate yourself about your body? I know it's a long question, so I can repeat any part of it if you forget any part.
It's okay. Yeah, I think this is something that I really had to work on. And I've even thought about like the map of like how it went throughout the years. Because so figuring out how to advertise your body, your look, your personality, if you gotta like make up something new, figure like that can force you to look at yourself and be super critical of, and it depends on where you work. So for example, my club is more like people of color centered, and we get a lot more clients of color. But I have a friend who works in a more white club. It's very VIP centered. It's full nude. There's no alcohol, so it's definitely like a different hustle. And we were talking about our experiences, and they were just like, yeah, I have like a certain part of their body was something that was like undesired in that setting, but in my setting, it's like yeah, like the thicker the better. Like it's like very it's such a big difference in terms of like the specific hustle that you have. Not to mention too, in terms of full service work, when strangers see you naked and they want to fulfill their ultimate fantasies, and if you don't fit that to the T, like they'll definitely let you know, which is sometimes like not even the best ways. Or sometimes they'll give some odd like backhanded compliments, which is weird. Like yeah, and to them, like they a lot of cis hetero men like sometimes really genuinely think that things are like compliments and that things are nice when they're just like not. It's like not something you should say to someone. And I remember when I first started stripping, it fulfilled this desire to be seen as attractive, and it really like affirmed that. But later on, as I got more like kind of used to it, I guess, or I just realized that men will just kind of say, like cis hetero men will just kind of say things. I started becoming like really repulsed about it, especially like outside of work. I started to just really assert my boundaries and protect my spaces, and I stopped being scared of speaking up. So I know I can tell when like other folks get comfortable, I'll like check in with them, and if they feel uncomfortable, I'll help them like assert their boundaries too, so I'll speak up if I see someone harassing somebody else, which is something that I wouldn't have done prior to sex work. Something else, like I think something very specific towards being a queer sex worker is that I learned how to like market my bisexuality, and I'm actually pansexual, but people don't really know what that is, so they're just like, oh, okay, bisexual, I know what that is. So I've had to teach like some straight women how to have queer sex for show, and I think it's just really, really interesting. Like, but I would say that the most difficult part of navigating sex work and my body has been having to present very cisgender and very feminine, which I think makes me feel like a little bit of dysphoria. But I feel like I'm still working through that, so it's definitely a work in progress. But so for example, too, I've gotten plastic surgery. I got plastic surgery when I was like 21. So I would consider myself like pretty young. At the time, I didn't really know how to like take care of myself afterwards or how to like navigate that. And I noticed that though after I got plastic surgery, people started treating me different, and which I think is like it's a privilege for sure. And I tried to do it to make myself a little bit more marketable. And I'm in the process of getting more plastic surgery because I do have this vision for myself, but I really want to get bottom surgery. And I also had to stop taking testosterone because I didn't want my voice to change like too much. So it's definitely navigating like all of that, all the gender dysphoria, all the like wanting to get surgery, like etc. That's been really hard. Because if I do get bottom surgery now, I'll definitely be subjected to more violence, which is a testament to the amount of privilege that cis women have and that people who are passing have over sex workers who might not pass. But I think I had to teach myself to find more community and to really seek that out and to really check in with myself in terms of like how I'm feeling, you know, and when I'm up for sex work, which again, like the flexibility and being able to decide like, hey, like I feel more masculine today. I don't think I want to put makeup on. I don't think I want to dress a certain way or perform femininity today, which I'm glad that I have the option to do so. I think the other thing that I feel like is not really talked about, because oftentimes when we talk about sex work, we want to talk about like this positive and empowering and just super, but it's really complicated. You know, it's a job, and not all jobs have the greatest working conditions, or you know, it's just like any other job basically. But particularly amongst the party crowd, I would say that I think like alcohol was something I really had to learn and teach myself and relearn, because when I was 21, I was like, oh my God, I can drink in public now. This is great. And now people are going to buy me shots all the time. This is wonderful. And I get to drink at work and make money, and this is awesome. And initially it was cool. Like I had a lot of fun, but then like doing too much alcohol is like, it's just a bad idea, especially like if it's your work and you're working full time, you're going 5 days a week of drinking heavily. So, and I also have depression and anxiety and stuff. So sometimes when I feel like, oh my God, I need a drink in order to get rid of my anxiety or to ease my anxiety, I have to do the work of working through that. And when I feel depressed, I have to say, you know what, maybe I shouldn't drink right now because I'm not in the right state for that. And it did take me a long time of learning how to say no when it was so easy to say yes, like to alcohol. So now I feel like I definitely have the hang of it more. But yeah, that's definitely something I had to learn along the way. So yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine like when your work is in like a party or like that type of atmosphere, it's really easy to get caught up in that. I think about that a lot, and just in terms of like the LGBT community, that a lot of those spaces just are like centered around like alcohol and drug use. So then there's like another level of that when that's like that's part of your job to be in that environment. Something that I was thinking about when you talked about sort of like the marketing yourself and advertising yourself aspect, and then kind of like tying back into the desirability piece of like white thin bodies being seen as like the idea of when we think of like sex workers. I think especially like virtually, like online right now, like, and then even you talking about like like I don't want to perform femininity, and like how that impacts like your work. Could you like speak to like that piece a little bit more? I thought that's because I also think of like in terms of like being a person of color and like
Mhm.
okay, if like white thinness is like the standard of like beauty and like sexuality, like who they're supposed to be sexually attracted to, then like oftentimes like the flip side of that is like in order to market yourself, that might involve like some level of like fetishization of yourself or like
Oh yeah,
exotification of yourself. um
yeah. So there's, I guess I'll explain like a little bit. There's different ways to advertise like online, and a lot of I'm sure most folks have seen porn or scroll through porn. Which, by the way, y'all should pay for porn. OnlyFans is the farm to table of the porn industry. So, but on that note, if you're scrolling through a bunch of porn, you see like big butt Latina, like, you know what I mean? And it's just like, not only is it reducing you to your body parts, it's also reducing you to your race. And just the fact that they have to like specify, or that you have to specify, like, I am X, Y, and Z, or I am like mixed, or I'm exotic, I'm different. Like that's kind of showing that white is like the norm, because white folks don't have to do that. You know what I mean? They don't have to exotify themselves because they are seen as the standard. Um, so it's definitely, and then I think in-person work is a lot different than online work, because you see um, just like the things that people will say to somebody that they don't really see as fully human is you know interesting. Sometimes they don't know like the proper terminology for things, so I think that's another thing. But yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of like fetishizing. Um, and then my friend who works at the white club, they're Latinx, and they're very much like, oh yeah, I'm Latinx, but I'm light skinned, and I'm like, I'm not one of like the, it's kind of like sucks, because there's times where in order to make a sale, like you have the choice of either like distancing yourself from other people or like embracing it. And I don't know, I think if you have the ability to lose that sale, that's a privilege, because not everybody can afford to lose that sale, you know, in exchange for further dehumanizing themselves or their race. So you're put in like a lot of interesting positions. Um, yeah, which is just, it's the reality of trying to market yourself and trying to appeal to the crowd that you're trying to appeal to, which is often, um, cis men or what have you.
so what does it mean to feel powerful for you, and when do you feel powerful, or when have you felt
Um, I think I think there's a power in vulnerability, and I think there's a power in being soft, because in a world that tells you that softness is weakness, to really turn around and defy that, I think it means a lot. It means a lot about you, and it means a lot about just like, the way that you view vulnerability. Um, I also think being unapologetically you is being powerful. I think that helping other people is powerful when you have like no stake in it, and um, you don't expect anything in return. Um, I think like even being spiritual is powerful. And I think I feel powerful when I think about like all the people that came before me, and all the people that like were able to get me, were able, who came a lot, like, I guess the people who came before me, so that way I could be standing here today and freely talk about sex work, when it's something that was just so taboo before, and people lived on the outskirts of society for this. And especially because it's so entrenched in queer history too. Um, and I really feel like impressed with the generation that's like coming forward, that's like that's come after me, because like they're teaching each other how to do like all kinds of wild stuff on like TikTok, for example, or like they're just, they're setting a new standard and really like interrogating their languages and stuff like that. And I think that's like really, that makes me feel good, like dang, like look at where they're going. And I think in terms of sex work, when we explore like the sexuality of power and power play, it makes me feel like really happy when someone is able to like to explore themselves in a different way. Like for example, with like pegging. Uh, for those that don't know, pegging is when someone wears a strap on, and usually the receiver is like a cis male or like will be male, and they're yeah, and they try to work through it, and they're just like, well, what does this mean? I'm queer. Does this mean, you know? But just creating a safe space for them to like explore their bodies and explore themselves. I think that's also like a sense, something that gives me a sense of power.
I love hearing you talk about that piece, and I also see how that kind of relates to like authenticity and like vulnerability that you
Mm-hmm.
touched on, of like the powerfulness of that. And I think I have not very often heard like people who are sex workers like touch on that piece. So I think that's like really interesting to hear from you.
I think it's like there's this thing called doming from the bottom or like subbing from the top, and it's just like, you know, maybe just because whatever position you're in, that doesn't mean that you can't do what you would expect is the opposite, you know. So you can't, just because you're the receiver doesn't mean you can't also be dominant, for example. So I think about that a lot.
So if we can understand the ideas of the body, gender, sex, and sexuality to be socially constructed, in relation to power, what does that mean to exercise the power of queer and trans people of color, like in their bodies? Like what?
I think that beyond you know, one of the beauties of existing outside of like what's socially acceptable is that we can carve out our own spaces and that we can create space for everybody. um I think that whether we're creating like underground queer trans dungeons or having spaces to cater specifically towards asexual and grayscale people, um you know, there's room for everybody. And these spaces are created by us for us. So I think that's an immense way to exercise our own power, like right now, you know. And I know that capitalism makes these spaces in our existence like hard for sure, but being able to reimagine ways in which we can help each other thrive and be ourselves and use our bodies to create spaces and experiences and adorn them however way we please, modify them however way we like. And I think there's also a way for us to use that to demolish these systems of oppression. Um, and I think also understanding that we don't have to lose our like practices or culture or ties to our culture just because we're using our bodies in ways that might be deemed as like different than what's maybe traditional, or they view it as like white or Western. I think as queer people, we've been here for thousands of years across all the world, throughout so many different generations. So I think when we talk about like social constructs, we have to think about like what societies we're talking about and how we can re-envision new ways of interacting with each other. So yeah.
And I think also, yeah, again, disrupting the idea that those concepts are universal by recognizing that they are social constructs, and so they vary across different like cultures, and that again, there's room for everybody. So I really like that piece. So what does this power between gender, sex, and sexuality look like for you as a sex worker, and how has it impacted you?
um like I said, I think like there's power in creating spaces for people that are going through similar experiences, or and I think there's a lot of power in giving having a sense of understanding and be able to connect with someone who's going through something um, similar to you. And I think that for me, sex work has challenged the ways that I view my femininity. I've had been forced to explore it and embrace it in a lot of ways that I really felt uncomfortable with before, because I feel like my perceptions of what it meant to be trans was that I have to, it was like still with the, existing within this binary of like I have to be more masculine in order for people to like recognize it. I was just like no, this is me. I want people to know and to see it and to, you know, and I thought that that's kind of what uh how I would find community was just by like presenting like in the most masculine way. And also like growing up from a Latinx family, they tend to see femininity as like weakness. And my mom really wanted a boy, so she was like, well, I got like an AFAB person, so I'm just gonna like make them be as masculine as possible and just reject all femininity. But after sex work, I was just like, okay, I have to learn how to like do makeup and how to like, curl hair and stuff like that, things I had no idea of how to explore before. And so I also like changed the way I dress differently. And then I realized that clothes really don't have a gender. So yeah, and I think that like it also forced me to grapple the ways in which I navigate different systems of oppression, and how I hold privilege over other sex workers and other ways in which I don't have privileges. So yeah, it's definitely.
What are steps that people can continue to take to push and fight back against the construction of queer and trans POC bodies as disposable, or more specifically queer and trans POC sex workers bodies as disposable, and continuing to advocate for like the rights of sex workers, the respect of sex workers?
I definitely think that first and foremost, I feel like change starts with you. It starts like in challenging your own beliefs about sexuality and sex, and how you view how you view others. So for example, there's literally nothing wrong with having sex for money, but there is something wrong with the stigma surrounding it, because that creates violence and that creates further dehumanization. And yeah, I think just really checking your language and checking the language of the people around you is, I think, one of the most fundamental ways that we can humanize each other. Which, like, I know when I started 5 years ago, people kind of wouldn't, there wasn't really like the language surrounding it of how to talk about sex workers. And it was, people would make like a lot of like stripper jokes or like hooker jokes, and it was just kind of not super great. But I didn't know how to word why it made me feel uncomfortable. And now like that language, at least in my circles, has like stopped. I think another way too is mutual aid. The thing about sex work is that and any other type of hustle, is that it's not consistent. There could be times when you're making a lot of money and other times when it's really slow right now. So for example, a lot of sex workers can't get government aid. A lot of sex workers can't get into housing because they either don't have a bank account, or because they don't have proof of income, for example. So if you see someone who's saying like, or even just anybody who's in trouble, who is asking for people to donate, I think directly donating to people in need or helping each other out, or it could be just in any type of way, I think is definitely a good way to challenge that. I think learning about like harm reduction and trauma informed approaches to interpersonal communication. Also informing yourself on the prison industrial complex. I believe it specifically, like, I think Black women were one of the highest increasing rates of incarceration. They have one of the fastest growing rates of incarceration. And so just like seeing how these big systems will affect us and affect each other in different ways. I think also, if you are a queer person of color, especially if you're a queer person of color sex worker, I think self-care is super important, and seeking out services that are really directly geared towards your needs are also super important. I know there's some therapists who are specifically geared towards sex workers, for example, specifically geared towards queer people of color. And also, I think just like always being mindful of where, like I said, of your language and your actions and your facial expressions and everything, because there's so many of us everywhere. I'm sure someone out there is a sex worker that you know. I'd also like to mention too, in terms of the language, that I have a friend who's a street-based sex worker, and they point out that the term sex work was originally made to encompass the entire sex worker community, including people do in-person work, scripting, cam work, like etc. But I think they also said that the same community tends to leave out marginalized people. So there's a lot of like lateral whorephobia that I think we need to address too, especially in the full service, especially for the full service street-based workers. They tend to get left out a lot. Also, I think they had mentioned that even the term sex worker was making it more palatable for the general population than the word prostitute. So there's still a lot of like in community discussion, and there's still a lot. I think there's still a lot of a long ways for us to go. So yeah, so keeping yourself aware on that and the growing language. There's also bills and laws that have passed that harm sex workers, and they also harm like people who aren't doing sex work too. So for example, FOSTA SESTA had passed about 2 years ago, and it basically made advertising illegal under the guise of stopping sex trafficking, but really it made it harder to find victims of sex trafficking. So they basically, like, for example, the hashtag women on Instagram was like taken off and deleted, but the hashtag men was still on there under the guise of on Instagram for the under the guise of like FOSTA SESTA. And it got rid of like Backpage, which was a lot of people's way of advertising, and that forced them to work outside when before they were working inside, which led them up to more danger. They couldn't like scam their clients, or not scam their clients, but I guess they couldn't like vet their clients. I guess they couldn't really like verify if they were on like a no date list, basically. And it led to more censorship in the media. There's the Earn It Act too, which is coming up, and basically the government can scan and read encrypted messages and has more access to our information. So a lot of the websites that sex workers use now can be like all the messages can be read. Basically, it's just a lot more invasive, and that puts folks at more risk. So yeah, just being aware of like all the different laws that are going to be passed and how that can affect us, being careful of your language, and just really trying to respect and humanize us as folks, and doing mutual aid outside of nonprofits. I think that that's one of the ways that folks can really help and humanize us, you know.
Just because you touched on it a little bit, I think something that I hear a lot is the equating of all sex work being related to like sex trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
And then using that as like through political action to
Mm-hmm.
like negatively impact sex workers. Could you like touch on that a little bit?
Basically, so a lot of the times people will say something like, everybody who's being trafficked is not doing it out of their consent. Basically what a lot of like SWRPs say is that we don't have like a choice, we lack agency. For example, just because money is exchanged, that means that the person cannot consent to it because they were forced to do it for money. And I think that that's very I think it's very reductive of all of our different experiences, because at the end of the day, if you don't work under capitalism, you're not going to survive, and I think that all really there's nothing wrong with the idea, like I said, of having sex for money, so long as it's consensual between both parties. When it's not consensual, then it's either assault, or it's sex trafficking. And like, for example, I know this is one of the things, like minors can't consent, so that's, to me, I feel like it's more trafficking. But I think that that's a lot, that's a more complicated one too, because there's some folks who are minors and who run away and who do sex work in order to survive. Maybe they're leaving from an abusive situation. I think it's like it's very complicated, and to just create this black and white, very reductive kind of model isn't helping anybody. If anything, it's making it worse. There's a lot of organizations too that will say, we'll save women from sex trafficking by they'll arrest you, and then they'll have you go to like this kind of community service thing where they're saving you from sex trafficking by having you make and sell bracelets. But I like, it's not really helping you survive. So it's just like the you know what I mean? It's just like, what are you really doing? So yeah, I mean, I hope that answers your question. I think it takes people's agency away. Basically, the difference is agency.
Well, if any attendees have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat or use the Q&A function. That's all the questions that I personally have prepared. I don't know if you have anything else you just want to say while we give them a couple seconds to come up with questions.
I guess like maybe a little plug-in on like what I'm trying to do. I guess for a little background on myself, my like ultimate dream is to become. I'm going for my master's in public health right now. Well, I'm gonna start in the fall, hopefully with COVID. COVID really messed up a lot of things for sex workers, and I think for a lot of people in general. So yeah, but I'm I'm gonna be studying urban disparities in public health, and I really wanted to focus on migrant sex workers, especially in TJ, because TJ is like the spot where people will either try to cross over into here, or they'll get stuck over there and just like kind of stay in TJ even though they come from like different parts of Mexico or Central America, or even different parts of the world. There's a lot of Haitian migrants there too. So really what I want to do is kind of create like a shelter and a center for them to be able to have these safe spaces and to be supported. So yeah, because housing is a human right. So
we have a question. So have you seen improvements in the LGBTQ plus community in the sex industry, meaning more acceptance or understanding of community?
I would say it depends on where. It depends on where you are. I work with like young people now, young queer people. I have I ended up getting a 9-to-5 partially because I feel like I was drinking excessively, so I had to switch gears. Also having gaps in your resume isn't great. But yeah, some of them I think are some of them are sex workers, and some of them are really helpful and understanding towards each other. Some are very like fascinated by it, you know, and I think that like I get it. There's definitely a it's interesting, you know, being a sex worker, and there's so many different stories than other customer service jobs. But I tend to find that a lot of LGBT and queer folks tend to be more accepting of sex work than cis hetero folks. For sure, I think a lot of folks have started to like explore and delve into it. You know, so I think it's definitely become more accepting over the years. Even though sometimes you still get like little kind of comments or shade or like back and forth, you know, but I think overall it's become a lot more accepting and understanding.
Any other questions, attendees? Or hopefully that answered your question. If it didn't, if you have a follow-up question, feel free to submit. Well, thanks, Brian. Well then, I think that's it. So thank you so much for doing this for us and creating this space and answering questions and sharing so much about your own experiences. I really appreciate you doing that.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for giving a platform to sex workers and to being able to let me kind of talk a little bit about what's been going on. It's become so normal to me that I forget that other people are sex workers too. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you.